You close your eyes, and the first thing that returns is not the face of an enemy, but the smell of mud, that particular combination of earth and blood and cordite that becomes its own element in war, something that exists nowhere else in nature, that can only be created when men gather in fields with the express purpose of ending each other. The taste of it coats your tongue even now, 50 years dissolved into memory, and you are 22 years old again, crouched in a trench somewhere in Korea, where winter comes down from Manchuria like the wrath of something ancient and pitiless, where the cold is a solid thing, a presence that enters through your boots and climbs your bones like frost on window glass, turning your feet into distant countries you can barely feel, turning your fingers into clubs that can barely grip the rifle that might be the only reason you see tomorrow. Your name is James Cooper, farm boy from Iowa, and you never asked to be here, never imagined that the cornfields of your childhood would lead to this frozen hell where the night sky lights up with tracers like some terrible celebration, like the 4th of July reimagined by a god who has forgotten mercy and remembers only fire. Across the valley, maybe 300 yards away, maybe less, there is another young man in another trench, and his name is Chen Wei, and he is also 22, also cold, also wondering how he arrived at this particular coordinate on the map of his life, this point where everything narrows to the simple question of whether the sun will rise on his living face or on his corpse freezing in the mud. You have never met Chen Wei, and Chen Wei has never met you, but you will kill each other or try to. That is the agreement nations have made on your behalf, the contract signed in your blood before you were old enough to understand what signatures cost. The wind cuts across no man's land like a blade made of ice and absence, and you listen to it howl through the broken landscape, through the skeletal trees that stand like monuments to some catastrophe of nature, stripped of everything except the bare fact of their existence. And you think about home, about your mother's kitchen, where the smell of bread baking could make the world make sense, where the hardest decision was which chore to do first, not which direction to point a weapon designed specifically to unmake human beings. The stars above are the same stars that shine on Iowa, the same constellations your father taught you to read on summer nights when the corn was high and the future seemed like something benevolent, something that would unfold according to plan. And you wonder if Chen Wei is looking at these same stars, if he knows their names in his language, if he has a father who taught him to navigate by light that left its source before either of you were born, before this war was even a possibility in anyone's imagination. Morning comes like a rumor, gray light spreading across the valley without warmth, and you know what it means. You've learned the rhythm of this place, the way dawn triggers movement, the way men emerge from their holes in the ground and advance toward other men emerging from other holes, and the machinery of killing activates like clockwork, like something ordained by physics rather than choice. You move forward because the man behind you moves forward, because stopping means dying alone, because the logic of war creates its own gravity that pulls you toward conclusions you never agreed to. And somewhere Chen Wei is also moving forward, also caught in the same terrible current, and the distance between you is closing like a fist around light.
You learn Chen Wei's face in the fraction of a second before everything explodes into chaos. In that suspended moment when two human beings recognize each other across a distance measured not in yards, but in the gulf between killing and being killed. His eyes meet yours, and they are dark and wide and contain the same terror you feel expanding in your own chest like something with claws. And you see that he is young, impossibly young, that the uniform hanging on his frame is too large, that his hands grip his rifle with the desperate intensity of someone who knows the weapon is all that stands between him and oblivion. The firefight erupts around you like a sudden storm, bullets splitting the air with sounds like fabric tearing, like the world itself coming apart at the seams, and you throw yourself behind a ridge of frozen earth, and Chen Wei disappears behind an outcropping of rock, and for the next 6 hours you are trying to kill each other without ever seeing each other again, firing at muzzle flashes and shadows and the suggestion of movement, reducing human beings to problems of trajectory and timing. When it ends, when both sides have exhausted themselves into a temporary ceasefire born of ammunition shortage and exhaustion, you crawl back to your trench with the taste of copper in your mouth and the knowledge that you hit something, someone, that your bullets found flesh somewhere in that chaos, but you don't know whose flesh, don't know if Chen Wei is among the shapes lying still in the snow, or if he made it back to his own lines. The war continues this way for months, the same valley, the same hills, ground taken and lost and taken again in a rhythm that seems designed by something insane, by minds that have forgotten what any of this is for, that are moving pieces on a map without remembering that each piece is someone's son, someone's brother, someone who had a life before this and dreamed of having a life after. You learn to not think about the faces, to not imagine the men across the valley as people with mothers and sweethearts and favorite songs, because thinking that way makes the rifle heavy, makes the trigger resist your finger, makes survival complicated by the weight of conscience. But Chen Wei's eyes stay with you, float up in your memory during the long watches, during the nights when sleep is impossible because the cold is too intense, or the shelling too close, or the screams of the wounded too loud. And you wonder if he remembers your face the same way, if somewhere in his trench he is also lying awake, thinking about the American boy he almost killed, about the moment when they were close enough to see each other as something other than targets. April brings the thaw, and with it the offensive that will define your war, the push north toward the 38th parallel, toward lines on maps that mean everything to generals and nothing to the men who bleed over them. You advance through landscape transformed by spring into something almost beautiful, ice melting into streams, the first green pushing up through soil churned by artillery, and you find the Chinese positions abandoned, retreated in the night, leaving behind only the detritus of occupation, shell casings and empty ration tins and shallow graves marked with sticks. In one of these positions, you find a photograph half buried in mud, and you pick it up without thinking, wipe the dirt away, and see Chen Wei's face looking back at you from some time before the war, younger somehow, though it can't have been that long ago, standing with an old woman who must be his grandmother, both of them smiling in front of a house with tiled roof and trees heavy with some fruit you can't identify. You should leave it there, should let it dissolve back into the mud with everything else this war destroys, but instead you fold it carefully and put it in your breast pocket, carry it through the rest of the campaign, through the battles that follow, through the eventual ceasefire and the long journey home. You never see Chen Wei again, never know if he survived, if he made it back to that house with the tiled roof.
if the old woman in the photograph lived long enough to see him return, and the not knowing becomes its own kind of weight, its own species of haunting that follows you back to Iowa, back to the farm where you try to resume a life that no longer fits quite right, like putting on a coat you've outgrown. You carry the photograph through decades, like a splinter working its way deeper into flesh, something foreign that your body can't expel, can't absorb, just has to accommodate as part of the new architecture of who you are after war. The farm demands your hands and your back, and the simple, repetitive rhythms that governed your father's life and his father's before him, plowing and planting and harvest, the eternal cycle that cares nothing for what happened in Korea, that asks only that you show up and do the work that needs doing. You marry a girl from the next county, Linda, who has kind eyes and doesn't ask too many questions about the silences that sometimes swallow you whole, about the nights when you wake up choking on dreams of frozen mud and tracer fire. And you have children, 2 daughters who grow up knowing only that their father went to war once, but never quite came all the way back. The years accumulate like sediment, layering over the raw places until they're smooth enough to touch without bleeding. And you think less about Chen Wei as time passes. Think less about that valley where young men learned to hate people they'd never met, where ideology became ammunition and politics became the mathematics of body counts. But the photograph stays in your desk drawer, tucked inside a Bible you never read. And sometimes late at night, when sleep is elusive, you take it out and study that face, wondering what happened to the boy behind those eyes, whether he's looking at your photograph somewhere across the ocean, whether he kept some scrap of evidence that you existed, that for one moment in that frozen hell you saw each other as human beings rather than targets. It is 1998 when the letter arrives, forwarded through the Veterans Association, through channels you don't fully understand, written in careful English by someone who signs himself Chen Wei from Beijing, and the name detonates in your chest like ordnance that's been buried for 50 years, waiting for someone to step on it wrong. He writes that he has been searching, that after his retirement he began looking for American veterans who served in his sector, using dates and unit designations and the fragmentary records that survived, and he thinks, he believes, he hopes that you might be the young soldier he encountered that morning in April 1951, the one whose face has haunted him through 5 decades of trying to forget. He writes that he has survived the war, returned to China, became a teacher, married, had a son who is now grown with children of his own, and he writes that he has spent his life trying to understand what happened to them both in that valley, trying to make sense of how nations can demand that strangers kill each other and then expect them to return to normal life as if violence on that scale doesn't fundamentally alter the structure of the soul. He asks if you would be willing to meet, suggests a Veterans Reconciliation Conference being organized in San Francisco, a gathering of old soldiers from both sides who are trying to build bridges across the chasm of history. And you read the letter 3 times, 4 times, until the words blur and your hands shake with something that might be fear or might be a kind of terrible hope. Linda finds you at the kitchen table with the letter spread in front of you like evidence at a trial,
and she sits down across from you and takes your hand and asks what you're going to do, and you realize you don't know, that the question splits you down the middle between the young man who learned to hate in Korea and the old man who has spent 50 years trying to outlive that hate, trying to prove that what happened there doesn't have to define everything that comes after. You write back, your handwriting shaky, words coming with difficulty, because how do you address someone who tried to kill you, who you tried to kill, who survived the same nightmare and somehow made it to the other side, still looking for connection rather than revenge? You tell him yes, you'll meet him, you'll come to San Francisco, and even as you write it, you feel something shifting in your chest, some weight you've carried so long you forgot it was there, beginning to move, beginning to suggest the possibility of being set down. The conference is in September, and you fly alone, because Linda understands this is something you need to do without witnesses, without anyone who loves you watching to see if you break or heal or something in between. And the hotel is full of old men who look like you, faces carved by time and memory, bodies bent by the weight of years and the invisible scars that never show up on X-rays, but never stop aching either.
You see him across the hotel lobby, and recognition hits like a physical blow, like stepping on ice you thought was solid and feeling it crack beneath your weight, because 50 years have rewritten both your faces, have added decades of gravity and weather and wear. But the eyes are the same, those dark eyes that met yours across frozen ground when you were both young enough to believe you might be immortal, both terrified enough to know you weren't. Chen Wei stands beside a translator, a young woman who looks uncomfortable with the weight of what she's being asked to facilitate, and he is smaller than you remember, diminished by age the way all men are diminished, the way time reduces everyone to the essential fragile fact of flesh that bleeds and breaks regardless of uniform or flag or cause. You walk toward each other through a space that feels larger than any battlefield, through air that seems to thicken with each step, and you stop 3 feet apart, close enough to see the liver spots on his hands, the way his shoulders curve forward, the tremor in his fingers that matches the tremor in your own. And for a long moment neither of you speaks, because what language exists for this? What words bridge the distance between men who spent months trying to end each other and now stand face to face in a hotel lobby in California, trying to figure out if forgiveness is even the right word for what needs to happen here? He reaches into his jacket and pulls out a photograph, and even before he unfolds it, you know what it is. You recognize the creases, the way the edges have worn soft from handling, and it's your face looking back, 22 years old, scared, standing with your unit somewhere behind the lines, and he's kept it the same way you kept his, carried it through 50 years like a question that never got answered, like evidence of something that happened that the history books will never record. The translator begins to speak, but Chen Wei waves her quiet, and he reaches out his hand, not for a handshake, but palm up, an offering, a gesture that transcends language, and you place your hand in his and feel the calluses there, the rough evidence of a life spent working, surviving, continuing, and his grip is firm despite the tremor, and you understand that you are both crying, tears running down faces that have forgotten how to be young, and the other veterans in the lobby are watching, but you don't care, because this moment is bigger than pride, bigger than the careful distance men maintain to protect themselves from feeling too much. You sit together in the hotel restaurant, and the translator works to carry meaning back and forth across the ocean of language, and Chen Wei tells you about the morning you met, tells you he fired high on purpose that first burst, couldn't make himself aim center mass at someone whose eyes he'd looked into. And you tell him you did the same, that after you saw his face, the war became impossible in a new way, became a betrayal not just of him, but of something fundamental about what it means to be human. He tells you about the winters after Korea, how the cold never left his bones, how he still can't sleep when the temperature drops, how his wife learned to pile blankets on him in the night and not ask why he wakes up gasping. And you tell him about the dreams, about waking up certain you're back in the trench, about the way loud noises still make you flinch, about the guilt that came from surviving when so many didn't, about the particular torture of not knowing who you killed, of carrying that uncertainty like a stone in your chest. The conversation stretches for hours through lunch and into afternoon, and somewhere in the middle of it you realize that what you're doing is mourning together, grieving for the boys you were before men in offices decided that your deaths would serve some purpose, that your bodies were acceptable prizes for whatever prizes nations fight over. Chen Wei shows you pictures of his family, his son who became an engineer, his grandchildren who have never known war, who live in a China transformed almost beyond his recognition, and you show him pictures of your daughters, your own grandchildren, and you both understand that this is the victory if there is one, not territory taken or ideology defended, but the simple fact of continuation, of life persisting despite everything designed to stop it.
You stand now at the end of your own life, 88 years old, body failing in the incremental way bodies fail when they've carried too many miles, too many memories, too much weight of years that should have ended in Korea, but somehow didn't. Chen Wei died 3 years ago. His son sent you a letter with a photograph of the funeral, and you wept for a man who tried to kill you and became instead the person who helped you understand that survival without reconciliation is just a slower form of dying, that carrying hate across decades poisons everything it touches, turns victory into ash and homecoming into exile. You met 4 more times after San Francisco, twice in Beijing, where he showed you the house with the tiled roof from the photograph, where his grandmother had lived until she passed in 1960, never knowing how close she came to losing him in a war she didn't understand, and twice more in America, where you walked together through landscapes that had never seen combat, through parks where children played without flinching at sudden noises, and you talked about everything and nothing, the way old men do when they've run out of years for pretending that small talk matters more than truth. The conversations changed you in ways you still don't fully comprehend, cracked open something that had calcified around your heart, let light into spaces that had been dark for so long you'd forgotten they could be illuminated. You learned that Chen Wei had also become a teacher, that he spent 40 years trying to show children a different way, trying to plant seeds of understanding in soil that had been salted by propaganda and nationalism and the ancient human addiction to dividing the world into us and them. You learned that he woke up screaming too, that the war lived in his body the same way it lived in yours, that trauma speaks a universal language that crosses every border, recognizes no flag, answers to no ideology except its own insistent presence. Your daughters ask you sometimes what it meant, those meetings with the enemy who became a friend, and you struggle to explain because the words feel inadequate, feel like trying to describe color to someone who has only ever seen in black and white. You tell them that war makes monsters of ordinary men, that it takes boys who would never hurt anyone and teaches them to kill with efficiency and distance, and then it sends them home and expects them to forget what they learned, to unlearn the reflexes that kept them alive, to transform back into the people they were before they understood what humans are capable of doing to each other when given permission and weapons and causes that sound noble until you see them written in blood and cordite. You tell them that Chen Wei taught you something the politicians never could, that the man in the opposing trench is not your enemy, but your mirror, another young man who wants only to survive, to go home, to live a life that extends beyond the next firefight, the next artillery barrage, the next order to advance into fire.
The photograph of Chen Wei still sits in your desk drawer, but now it's joined by dozens more, a catalog of meetings and meals and conversations, of two old men learning to laugh about things that once would have killed them, learning to find in each other not the enemy they were trained to hate, but the brother they never knew they had. You think about the governments that sent you to that valley, about the ideologies that seemed so important then and seem so hollow now, about the way nations wage wars in the names of their citizens and then forget those citizens the moment the treaties are signed, leave them to carry the weight of what was done in the name of causes that dissolve like smoke the moment you try to hold them up against the reality of a human face. The wind outside your window carries the smell of Iowa in autumn, harvest time, the season of gathering what was planted in spring. And you think about planting and reaping, about how war plants only trauma and reaps only broken men, about how the cycle continues because we forget too quickly, because each generation thinks it will be different, thinks its war will be the righteous one, the necessary one, the last one. You wish you could tell every young person being handed a rifle and pointed at strangers that the enemy is not the person across the valley, but the system that puts you both there, that the real courage is not in pulling the trigger, but in refusing to see other humans as targets, in maintaining your humanity in situations designed specifically to strip it away. Chen Wei understood this, wrote about it in letters that came less frequently as his health declined, letters that talked about memory and responsibility, about the duty of survivors to bear witness, to tell the truth about what war actually is beneath the propaganda and the glory narratives and the monuments that make it all seem noble from a safe distance. He wrote that he forgave you, though there was nothing to forgive, that you were both victims of something larger than yourselves, both caught in machinery designed to grind men into statistics, and that forgiveness was less about absolving guilt than about refusing to let the hate perpetuate, about breaking the cycle that turns victims into perpetrators, about choosing to see the humanity in the person you were taught to destroy. You are dying now. You can feel it in the way your body is shutting down, systems failing like lights going out in a house at the end of a long day. And you think about Chen Wei waiting on whatever shore comes after this, if any shore comes at all. And you hope that if there is something beyond this life, you will meet him there, not as soldiers, but as the men you might have been if the world had been different, if nations had found ways to resolve their differences without feeding their young into the machinery of war. The greatest gift Chen Wei gave you was not forgiveness, but perspective, the understanding that the young man in the trench was not your enemy, but your double, that killing him would have been killing a version of yourself, that the real victory was not in survival, but in finding a way to live with what you survived, to transform trauma into wisdom, hate into understanding, enmity into the kind of friendship that redeems both parties by proving that humans can choose differently, can build bridges across chasms that seemed unbridgeable. You close your eyes and you are 22 again. You are 72 meeting Chen Wei in San Francisco. You are 88 watching the sunset over fields you've tended for 60 years. And you understand finally that this is what it means to be human, to contain multitudes, to be both the boy who learned to kill and the old man who learned to forgive, to carry within yourself the capacity for both terrible violence and transcendent grace, and to spend your life choosing which one to nurture, which one to feed, which one to pass on to the children who will inherit whatever world we leave them.